So yeah, they're
Hello. Yeah, no, but I don't even know.
Oh, yeah.
All right, good evening. Thank you all for coming out. This is on.
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Jessica Bagwell. I am the current Secretary Treasurer of the local Pumpkin Buttes chapter of the Wyoming Archaeological Society. We've been trying to have monthly speakers, and this evening we're lucky enough to have Mr. Cody Newton. Cody Newton is an archaeologist with over 20 years working in the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains in both academia and cultural resource management. He holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of Colorado Boulder and currently works at SWCA Environmental Services in Sheridan. Aside from horse evolution and Native American equestrianism, Dr. Newton's research interests include Paleo-Indian studies, bison evolution, bison-based subsistence, early European exploration, the historic Plains Indian Wars, and the historic Euro-American settlement. Tonight he is here to speak about an 1830s fur trade era site near Kaycee. Please welcome Dr. Cody Newton.
Thank you all for coming. I hold it about right there. Does that work for everybody?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to start out with how lucky I am to be working at this site, having been born in Buffalo and lived part of my youth in Kaycee. I was familiar with this site and the story of how it's been relatively well protected through time. And then once I went back to graduate school and really developed an interest in the fur trade, this was always on my list. And I'm an archaeologist. I like to excavate, but I also understand if things are protected, that's a good thing too. But as I'll talk about, there were some circumstances that just developed in the past few years that is allowed work at the site, and it's going to allow some excavation there as well. So we all know that there were, extensive trading networks. This is kind of a map, more of a schematic of stuff, probably pretty late, maybe right before contact, that kind of thing. But, we all hear about Obsidian Cliff, Obsidian and Hopedale sites, and this Pachuca Obsidian from New Mexico, or from Mexico City coming up into Kansas. And, a lot of these you can pretty much assume probably there was trading going on. Of course, there's the Southern Plains groups trading bison to the Puebloan groups for corn. So, trade networks were a part of this landscape. So when we kind of come up into historic times, and this is just kind of a zoom in a little bit on where we're at. So it's, like I said, it's a schematic, but we're going to be talking about kind of a point right in here. We're sitting right up in here. We start seeing, with the advent of the fur trade, we start seeing Euro-American posts and European posts. And I apologize for how small this writing is, but basically what we're looking at is some of the posts that were being run during kind of the 1830s and 1840s. And of course, there's some stuff that was earlier, there's some stuff that was after, and we are always talking about like a trade in furs with the mountain men, and but we're also talking about trade in bison robes, which became pretty popular in the mid to late 1830s. So a lot of these posts were also taking in bison robes, which was a product that was, made by native groups. So they were hunting the bison, skinning them, and dressing the robes. So it was something they did themselves. It's not like we sent out, there was trappers that did this thing. I mean, they probably knew how to do it, but it was mainly a Native American product. And it's also the reason why we see posts kind of strung up along, which would be like, this is the Front Range of Colorado. We've got 4 posts in here. Here's Fort William, which later becomes Fort Laramie. And then here's the Portuguese Houses, Bighorn Mountains, and then some stuff up along the Yellowstone. Well, first of all, this is an artist's depiction of the Portuguese Houses, or Fort Antonio, drawn by an artist named Jack Roberts, who was a pretty famous Western artist in his time, but he was really interested in the posts, so he actually, made a painting of it. The other thing I will say is I kind of go back and forth. Portuguese Houses is the name that kind of became the most common moniker for this location. At the time, it was called various things, but I've seen official kind of correspondence where they call it Fort Antonio. So I tend to go with that, but I'll also say post, I'll also say fort. But it all means the same thing. And yeah, most people know it as the Portuguese Houses because the guy that ran it, had it built, was born in Portugal, probably around 1815. His name was Antonio Montero. Not much is really known about his early life, and I kind of question his birth date because it means he was out at like the 1833, fur trade rendezvous in, the Green River basin. He was like 18. And just the stuff he did afterwards, he was very young. Not to say he didn't do it. People kind of had to step up and do things back in those days. But anyway, in 1833, yeah, he was at the rendezvous. He was working for the American Fur Company. And this was just a little while after Captain Bonneville, Benjamin Bonneville, came west in 1832 with a bunch of wagons and was kind of going to try his hand at the fur trade. So he had a bunch of men, and a lot of what they talk about Montero, talk about Bonneville, was based on The Adventures of Captain Bonneville, written by Washington Irving, who also wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, pretty famous author, but he got a hold of Bonneville's journals and was really intrigued by him. And he said, hey, I'm going to write the story of what you did. So, and unfortunately, his journals have since been lost. So there's just this book by Washington Irving that talks about Bonneville. Well, Bonneville was out there offering pretty good wages, and Montero left the American Fur Company and started working for Bonneville. And this is about 1833. And we think it's about the fall of that year that he is sent to trade with the Crows. So we're talking about the Powder River Basin, basically, was Crow territory at that time. They were being, they had ongoing warfare with like the Blackfeet, Lakota, and Lakota groups. And these groups would eventually move the Crow out of there, and it would become Lakota territory by like the 1850s. But at this time, it was Crow territory, and outside K is what the Crow call themselves. So that's the word in the title. So initially, he went out in 1833 in the fall. He was staying in the Crow camp, trying to trade with the Crow. Things were a little too busy for him. The Crow were kind of mischievous, and they were also being attacked by the Blackfeet. So he decided to move his stuff 10 miles away from the Crow winter camp. and that's where he ends up here. You'll see some better pictures, but this is about 10 miles or 13 miles east of Kaycee, just right along Powder River. It's right on the north terrace of the Powder River. You can see it from the highway. It's right there. So he started with some cabins in that fall, and then in 1834, he actually built a stockaded post. And that makes about the third such post ever built in Wyoming. You got Fort Bonneville in 1832, Fort William, which later becomes Fort Laramie, but it's like the third such building. But as I said, you know, there was some tumultuous times here with the Blackfeet and the Crow, their ongoing conflict. There was also competition with the American Fur Company. So there was one year that a brigade of American Fur Company trappers actually wintered here, not in the post, but next to it. And they say by the end of the winter that they'd been stealing things left and right just to, you know, because they were competition. And so there was things like that happening. And I think there's some evidence of this in some of the stuff we found. But eventually, yeah, by 34, 35, Antonio Montero becomes independent. And so this becomes his post. And he had a bit of a reputation as a scoundrel. He was barred from a trading license one year from the superintendent in St. Louis because of his bad reputation. And, you know, rightly so, I've kind of chased some things down. Of course, there's a pretty famous account by Osborne Russell where he was buying pelts that had been stolen by the Crow, and that's a no-no. And Russell's boss went into the post and said, "Give me the key to your storeroom. There's going to be some bad things happening," and he confiscated those back. And there's also a pretty crazy story, bad story. In about 1835 or so, a guy shows up at Fort Union that's basically starving and mostly naked. And he says he was one of Montero's men. Him and another guy were sent out in the fall to check on a cache of furs. Come that spring, Montero and everybody, they go to get those furs, and there's some packs of furs missing. And he blamed this guy and this other guy, took them captive, tortured them both to get them to tell where these furs are. One of the guys he was torturing died. So this other guy's thinking, well, I'm gonna die, you know, doesn't look good for me. And some of his friends that were working there, they kind of gave him a musket and some powder and said, get out of here. And he managed to get to the Big Horn and build a little boat and float down to Fort Union, along the way subsisting on like a dog and some fish and things like that. But that's not a nice story. But eventually, like a lot of posts, it was abandoned about 1839 or 1840. There was some things, you know, the robe trade kind of was tapering off, the bison robe trade. You had the financial panic of 1837 that kind of lasted into the 1840s. So you see a lot of posts going out of business about this time. So Montero, he went south to Taos, where he lived out his days. Probably lived in Mexico for a time too, and died in 1864. So with that, yeah, the post is abandoned. Don't really hear about it till 1859 when the Captain Reynolds was on kind of a fact-finding mission for the U.S. military. He had Jim Bridger with him as a guide. And Bridger had spent that winter with the brigade of American Fur Company trappers, so he was pretty familiar with it. And he tells a story about this place also being under siege by the Sioux for 40 days. So potentially a lot of things were tumultuous kind of events. But anyway, Reynolds sees this wall, and it's partially collapsed, but a lot of it's still standing. He talks about square hewn logs and, really well built. And I mean, this is 20 years later. It's still there. And again, it shows up on that 1883 government land office plat of the region, which is just kind of discovered this accidentally. But I mean, it's not super obvious, but it says corral, and it's right in the right spot. And if that thing could be taken for a corral, they definitely had a corral there. You could use those walls if they're still standing. So in 1883, they noticed it was still around. And this brings us up into the 1980s. Margaret Brock Hansen, who was a noted historian, Kaycee resident, she wrote a little piece about the. She also flew over it around sometime in the 80s, kind of the wing strut. But you can see kind of the real nice outlines of the post. So, you can see these walls. Now I done it. 1 second. You can see these walls real well. I mean, you can see potential interior walls. And as we'll see, there's possibly other walls out here that may be part of the corral. And then I'd point out that this right here is a monument that was placed in 1928. It was dedicated to the post. There was a local man, Mr. Mr. Esponda was kind of behind it. But in 1928, they placed this monument there. And I don't know if you can read that writing. He took his, well, I can read that writing. I got it. Well, it basically says he took his journey into a far territory, which is straight out of the Luke 15 parable of the prodigal son. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's basically he goes to a far land and acts unwisely. He loses a lot of his wealth. But I almost think it's more about him and Esponda, Mr. Esponda, feeling kind of a kinship with this guy, because he was a first generation Basque in the area. But anyway, but there is some misinformation on here. It says it's the first buildings in Wyoming, and that's not true. And 1830 is not true either. But there was, that kind of stuff floating around. This was 100 years ago. So, like I said, we're about 13 miles east of Kaycee. With this picture, you can kind of see the edge of the terrace. At the time that the fort was here, the river channel was probably only about 100 feet away from that. But this land was acquired by the Shavits, was the name of the family, in the 1940s, and they basically kept people off it as far as collecting or looting. They would let you come and look at the site. They were real neat about that, but they also didn't till it. They cut hay off it, but they left it alone, which is another reason it's, we're thinking it's in pretty good shape. There were definitely some things that happened before 1940, but all in all, it's in really good shape for something of that era, especially a post that's really evident to everybody that everybody wants to go, collect beads or metal detect, things like that. But anyway, May Shavit, the last remaining Shavit, she died in, I think, 2017. But anyway, the land, there was nobody to really pass the land on to, so it was sold to another landowner, and he put in a pivot irrigation system. And the thinking at the time was that the pivot he might expand it out and kind of roll right through the site. Luckily, that didn't happen, and also, but it did spur local historian and rancher Brock Hansen, Margaret Brock Hansen's son, to say, hey, well, maybe we should go out here and try and collect some of these artifacts in a systematic manner before things get destroyed or moved. So that's what they did with metal detectors. Like I said, fortunately, the site didn't really get impacted. Pivot avoids it. And also, Brock Hansen was able to work out an agreement with the landowner, Mr. Levitt, who graciously allowed them to come out and do this metal detector survey and is allowing ongoing work. So this is what was laid out. So it's basically a grid of numbered squares. Each square is 12 feet by 12 feet. So the total grid is about 168 feet by 156 feet. And like I said, each grid was numbered. Within each grid, there was it was further divided up into 4 quadrants, which were given the designations A, B, C, D. So if you found something, you know, we're talking about with not having precise ways to measure things and to map them. This works really well, especially when we know pretty much that these things are coming from a post. We can tell we're kind of inside the walls. But this does still give enough spatial information without, you know, having to point plot everything. It worked really well, and they did a good job. But so you'll see, yeah, an artifact might say 12D, well, then it's from square number 12, southeast corner, something like that. And they had this going and were just about done when I went and volunteered out there and kind of got invited to come back. Here's a picture of what it kind of looked like. Again, there's the monument, and you can see these laid down some, you know, that construction string and just made a big grid. And just, yeah, everybody was kind of assigned a grid and or assigned a square, and you did it and checked it off and moved on. This is Brock Hansen and Clay Gibbons doing some metal detecting outside the grid, but we did end up doing some outside. And when I came on, I have a GPS unit that's capable of shooting stuff in pretty tight, you know, about 10 inches. So some of this stuff was shot in later when we were outside the grid. But while these guys were kind of finishing that up, I wanted to kind of look at where the post walls were. You know, like I said, you can see these depressions, these linear depressions when you go out there. You know, it's pretty obvious, but to actually truth it, dug down and found wood. You can see in this picture, this stuff here, it's kind of washed out, but that's wood, crumbly wood, and it's, you know, a very kind of straight-sided wall, which makes sense. Or works with them saying there were square hewn logs. Again, another close up where, yeah, you can really see this is the wood. And I didn't get to the bottom. I went down as far as my arm. So they were set in there pretty well, at least 3 feet. And they were buried about 6 to 8 inches. This is the east wall, and you can see that red and sediment. And something was burned. You know, the wood was burned at some point. Who knows, fire, whatever. And you can see there's actually some of the wood looks a little charred too. But I sampled some of these things and sent them to some colleagues, and they turned in a surprise. It's cottonwood. I was thinking some of it looked a little suspicious, and I thought, well, it's right next to Pine Ridge. Pine Ridge kind of goes through right to the, on the west of that. And I thought, well, maybe they used pine with the stuff that stood up so long, but it's cottonwood, and it seemed to work pretty well. I kind of did a rough estimate based on when I dug down and found the walls in two spots on the side.
And this grid basically, other than the big bubble, is metal detector finds. Or, yeah, metal detector finds. We found some other stuff out in the holes we dug, but this is just the metal stuff. Here's some artifacts that you find in fur sites. Now, these aren't from the coast. These are from sites I've worked on in like southwest Wyoming, but I put them here just to show you that what we found at the coast. You'll see a lot of this stuff. I'm getting a lot of their goods from the same places. Americans often have the same preferences. I kind of went into this interest thinking, well, I'm going to look at these, these clay pipes and these beads, and I'm going to be able to tell who was what and when and where. And it's like, no, it's all the same kind of. So you got to look at other things, and we'll look at some other things. And just for reference, like this is a taper now. This is all a sharp end. This is a piece of cut brass, projectile pointed. And this is a cut metal, clay pipe fragments, and then the beads. Those are the spots I shared with you. Is little donut-shaped seed beads in the spot by far. First aid and quantity. And percussion cap, lead, kind of a lead, melted lead bar at the bottom left. We didn't find any percussion caps. The post kind of predates it a little bit. We don't really see records of percussion or the percussion guns. late. So another big lovely graph. Again, the smallest circle is 1, largest is 7 here. I should have put a key on this, but the red is cut nails, and the blue is cut wraps. The green is shoeing nails. I don't see a lot, super patterny, but if supposedly the corral and stuff was to the south, maybe why there's a few more shoeing nails on something with the grid. But think about how nails were the way things got fastened. Nails and staples and acting was with wood blocks. The needed nails. But they say like just your standard, even late. This is a standard like army supply box had like say 17 nails in it. So nails are really going to be there. It's something that the black bake into. It's fasteners. And here's some examples. Nails aren't the most exciting thing, but they are kind of interesting. I mean, a staple kind of in the upper left. And probably a couple of those might be hand wrought along the top, and then the different sizes of cut nails, and then your your main nails, your brass, the kind of metal shapes, and brass tacks, small tabs, maybe more decorative. I think now that this is a rivet. We'll talk about that later. Again, just more stuff we found. A wagon bow staple on the other part of the strike. They struck this, held it across the knuckles, and that piece. This shoe, this animal shoe, that's been chopped up. I mean, it was broken up for some reason. And then a couple pieces of file on the upper right. And the bottom left is, we think, is kind of a sharpening stone. Really dense, kind of fine grained. I think it's a spessartine quartzite. I think it's for it, but it makes a really good sharpening stone. This edge of it's really good, used to sharpen. It's worn and smooth from something getting across it. This is probably fit for like a hide flesher. So something like this that piece there. Again, these posts set up in these blacksmiths, pretty in general, and they made a lot of stuff. They made a lot of stuff to trade, things like that. They fairly easy to trade. Heads. Made a lot of those for trade. And then just some more finds. There's kind of a harness pocket, a couple of a little bit of design on it. What looks like a poker on the top, and another metal button. Part of a needle, and then a leather with some like grommet riveting, and then another grommet. Another map we're about talking about sprue, waste material from, in this case, lead sprue, from making musket balls. So they have the lead poured into the cast, stuff will fall off or whatever. And it shows up in all these pokes. There is about 161 pieces of sprue, about 1.1 pounds that was found. Again, I think this may kind of speak to how tumultuous it was there. Obviously, they were being attacked on, folks were being attacked on that. And they would get along with American fur companies, so they're doing stuff to each other. It's got a lot of lead, really, be laying around. Because I've looked at another post in California, on the South Platte, and it was extensively excavated. Like they pretty much dug it all. Got 0.14 pounds proof out of it. This was that you never hear about anything's going down there. It's pretty distance. Fort Davy Crockett over in Brown Skull, Northwest Colorado. Another post where there was conflict. It's actually kind of competing, not getting along. They had some battles with Native Americans, all that. They recently, but there's 2 pounds, not as much, but quite a bit. When things get bad, people start shooting, and when you shoot, you need more bullets, I guess. And here's some examples. So some really big pieces, also some shavings, and those little round ones are kind of where the hole gets filled up. So that last ball comes out, and you got to snake it off. Some of the muskets, musket balls, or round balls, we found 15. They range from about 50 caliber to maybe 30. There's some that have teeth marks on them, that was a thing. So musket balls, just kind of a normal fixation thing for some people. There's one of these, it's kind of an incomplete board, there wasn't quite enough lead, so it's kind of just flat side to it. And there are some impacted ones. More kind of firearms related. This is an actual barrel. It's in a really bad shape, kind of small apart, but it's the like a 40 cal. It's thick. You can see how thick it is, and then 40 cal. How thick that rifle barrel would be. Gun flints. So the top 3 are English gun flints, and they're pretty obvious by some of the characteristics they're made, and particularly by this great shirt. It's called Brandon Flint, and it's really famous. They were kind of the best, and they still make them to this day. I mean, they made them by come over on these ships in barrels, but the way they made them, chipped them off, was a little percussion coat. End up on makes you can tell they're Brandon flints. The one on the bottom, it's a French gun flint, and they were made a little different way. Called this ball, and it's the most common. It's really common material, so they're fairly diagnostic of where they came from, and again. You find both a lot of these interests. I'm all meeting out here, playing around the mountains. Two screws on the right, maybe firearms. I'm not. I've looked, and I'm no expert. Look at the bottom, maybe a prison spring bolt. It's like something like through the wood for a stock or something like that. I'm not sure. They are pretty well machined compared to what you can see. So we found 65 pieces of cut metal. Largest bubble was 14. And cut metal is scavenging or salvaging pieces of metal that got discarded, making new things like hydro tools. And the things, I was talking to a colleague and it just, dawned on me, like, talk about how him, like, yeah, that's a good idea. How much easier it is to make an arrowhead out of a piece of metal than a map. So there's no doubt that these things are really popular, and that not much more footing I can supply. Interesting thing here is most of it seems to be kind of maybe outside the post or maybe the wall. But you get to it like natives sitting there making things out of the scrap metal from the post. I'm sitting outside the wall, and we're allowed outside the wall, the trading posts. Thought using the wall as the windscreen for shade. And this is kind of what you see. You really see a lot of triangular pieces from making arrow points. It's kind of the big one. The upper left is actually the tip of a knife, so it's this is pretty classic. Like you can see the way this is cut. You can see maybe that being what was being arrowheaded. And to make this stuff, it's basically one old chisel. Like take a piece of hardened steel and max it. Pound a groove in the center metal, and snap it, and then sharpen it in. Here's some examples. You could find actually not a lot, but they're all kind of different. There's a study of metal flakes in Wyoming and nearby areas that was done by a colleague. He's got 4 or 5 styles. He's kind of trying to tie them to certain groups. It's not the greatest match, but things like this are found more often in the Southwest. Or like Kaycee, the idea of this cell. This is basically the bottom of something bigger. It might have been like glass or something, but it's got that serrated edge. So it bound onto a piece of wood. And ones like these, they all look pretty much. They weren't shipped out there. They weren't made in a factory because they did points as well. There's some by a blacksmith or by a native. And tinkler cones the same way. There's 3 in the middle. The tops are really nicely put together. And something that was shipped out there. They're put together. You see things like the bottom one, but they're a little rougher, maybe made, homemade or native made. Not that they didn't do things well, they just didn't quite have the tools, presses and all those kind of things. And then the bell to the left. I really need like a tree ring, a little bigger ring. I should have got more of a picture. It's got little whatever. And then a piece of something that may be kind of the same thing on the bottom of that, or a ring or something. Real popular. Quick talk about beads. I've always been interested in them, but yeah, again, not the greatest markers. The beads are a lot of what's found out there. And this type of bead, the seed bead, the donut shape, was made by one of them. They were not beads. They were the old tube of glass, million feet, meters. Fall off and through kind of a barrel. We're going to finish them with rough edges, a tumbler, I guess. You can see that they vary in sizes, and that's a product that changed through time. There's a little bit of dynamicity to them. They get smaller and more recent. So So if you take these seed beads and you measure, this is some chinking or maybe important by product. They say that most ones like an adobe type material. So when you take the length outside that curve, you can see they get smaller. This example from the 1860s, and some posts I've looked at and have pretty well-known dates, bigger ones. These are just some dates I've looked at which have dates. So these estimates. But these wood dots are what would be from Fort Antonio Fall. So you can see all through basically, and it makes sense. That was in one place. And there, people camped there. As well as post-occupation of these places. Tobacco pipes. So that big bubble you saw was an area about 6 feet by 6 feet screened, and it came up with 68 pieces of pipes. Ones that have markings, like right. Ones that you can, I mean, this was a breed that like Ring Bristol, and the Ring family were pipe makers in Bristol, England. The other side of it says Ohio, and my wife, nobody seems to know why I say Ohio, but they do. Again, but these pipes from this era, they have different makers, kind of similar styles. The whole anyway, but you do a little exercise where you say, okay, I've got so much length pipe stem, and average pipe so long. You look at that. Here you have about 16 pipes worth of pipes out of this little collection, like 6 by 6 area. Again, looking at Fort Vasquez, where they basically dug the whole thing, they had like 14 pipes worth of pipes. Secondary, but there was smoke. These pipes are, real clay. So they cut, the stem start out this long, so that they would get used. And you can actually put pounds and it would have been smoked. All right. This is, I think, the most interesting thing. So found about 26 of these. You can tell they're kind of wood. So, you have your rivet into this hole, and then these little things with like embedded wood, keep things just moving. And they're clustered out in the middle of the post, kind of maybe a plaza area. And I looked, had no idea. Do you know what they are? They're for putting, clinching. Was at a conference go and say, I was given a poster on this stuff, and there was another person there that was from Saskatchewan that was doing a poster about the post up there on the Saskatchewan River. They're things a lot like this in their photos. And so knowing that, I kind of dug into it, and lo and behold, I don't know how it could be. Basically, this clinker built kind of boats, like it's what the Viking invented, basically. So these things are used to, clinch the two boards. They overlap on the left. And it's for, you don't want interior structure, you make for a flexible light pole. Obviously, the Vikings is very low. And these are some that are actually from, so, these are modern. Okay, you want to build your lap straight or quicker with the boats. Not supposed to a car build, no boat, just this is on the side. We were the lighting boards and had a lot more interior structure. These were the boats you make really big, sail across oceans, find new worlds. Kind of led people from Europe coming here. That's a modern York boat. It's a Tinkerville boat. They were really popular, especially in the Great Lakes to Canada, where water was the main race to transport. So a lot of these trappers and traders got this knowledge. They lived there, around that. Back from a post. The Northwest Territories from the mid to late 1800s, when they were building boats. This is kind of from their spot. It's pretty familiar. So yeah, I think these are they're called straight roads, and they were used in boats. And why would somebody be building a boat? Well, can be floated, particularly maybe back then when no water was pulled up. It's being, and again, this is kind of a reconstruction based on tree rings. Tree rings on pictures are from that. You can use that as kind of a proxy for other information for environment. So this is the reconstructed stream flow of the Cod River, and right during the time of the post, above average, quite a bit in the last years, a couple of last years now. So, maybe float, not a big deal. These are some excerpts from about how these boats are made. They weren't terribly hard to make, evidently. Making a boat seems very complicated to me, but I'm a landlord. But yeah, the bottom has some, basically needed to, bend the boards, what they call a steam block. Yeah, a black slab straights. These rivets. Yeah, here we go. Now, why are these here? It just makes sense. Okay, they're building a boat. You've got these bicycles that are trading. Pack them, packs, which is about 150 pounds. Well, you float them down the river. So you trade them. Put them down. Now, maybe this boat, and so they would end up down there. It's pretty common. You build it, you float it down, and then you just go back up, walk back up, or you. But why is there these rivets here? Then why aren't you or somewhere else downstream? Well, maybe they were building a boat. Maybe they were building a boat because they get things out because they're being attacked by mutants and other trappers, or they were under siege. I don't know. Anyway, I can't find any other thing that explains that hardware, which I think is pretty record of that. There's some pictures of boats up in northern Wyoming, kind of big, like a picture gun. And a boat, right? It's the same kind of boat that Lewis and Clark has, Gal or something like that. There's a picture of something like that. It's definitely like that kind of know, I mean, it's somebody's on the river. So I'm gonna do it. Okay, well, not much more. So when you start looking into this post, and I talked about excavation, we got the finds from the detectors. And there's also been some early mass made. This was drawn by, name is not record, but it's a guy from the 20s, in the 20s, and he in this area. So he's showing rooms along the north room here, a gate there. Fast forward time, there's another map. So these are people going out there. This is probably Glenn's Queen. This collection, I don't know, he's one of the foundational members of the Wyoming Archaeological Society, sharing chapter. But I think it comes out of his records. It's maybe him, but again, a bastion on that corner, which a lot of these would have had, bastion on opposite corners under attack. This is Gene Galloway, who grew up in Buffalo and became an archaeologist, worked on some early sites around here. But he's got a little more detailed drawing, I guess. He's got kind of some bastion, nice, something on the northwest corner. Look at it, maybe a line of rooms along the wall and the monument. And then this rectangle is interesting that he saw something there, and we'll talk about that in a second. There was some remote sensing gradiometer, magnetic gradiometer, the difference between magnetic fields, things that are iron. This was done in 2007. It is pretty large. You can again see all this stuff right here. And so we were looking at that and with another colleagues, trading radar. Again, a remote sensing technology, this radar that goes down and down, gives you some kind of image of what's going on. Maybe a little more detailed, maybe much more detailed. So this is what I want to point out. This is where the walls are based on, what I found. Really square and there, which is kind of corresponds with that drawing in. This line of disturbance kind of keep that interior wall. So our goal is to go out there and do some tests on this screen, see if we can find those walls. We call anomalies, red areas, see what's there, if anything. And yeah, because right now we have a good sample, but it's pretty biased. It's on artifacts, basically. And I'd really like to find, evidence of these, things like that. So we're going to, like I said, go out in people and see, pin some things down, maybe find some areas to dig further. And with that, we'll say thank you.
Who did the actual construction on the wall?
Traverse.
Would have been any of the natives that would have done.
I don't hear about that happened, this wasn't their thing for sure. Yeah, those things, and gals, they worked. I don't know. Building posts, the time they use posts is pretty impressive.
So, is there access to the general public to that site?
There isn't yet. We're hoping that maybe someday there will be. Correct. with Spencer Pelt, they didn't look at that. He agrees that this is site, and it wouldn't be hard to get that access if it worked, because it's right off the highway about, you kind of just drive around, you know, the irrigated pivot right there. But yeah, right now it's also imagine.
So they cut down to
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, especially the viewing them, you see that in a lot of posts. They did it, and that's what it looks like in the ground.
So when you start going back and look at have you found like outhouse locations?
No, there's really nothing other than those kind of impressions. And there is probably a fairly substantial pre-contact camp underneath that. Since that high terrace over the river, it's just a great place. That would be another thing, is trying to determine how that relates to using for metal detector and see there's flakes on. Or not really. But yeah, we're kind of looking for that stuff, like just that, like that square and on the rock. They found it there, they might have it. So that's the thing, is to try to find these interior walls, try and, you know, do their excavations and maybe try to function. You know, house, that kind of stuff, or director's quarters, quarters. It's a lot easier.
When you go out there looking for evidence of what they ate, what are you looking for? Like what kind of stuff?
My interest is faunal analysis or archaeology, zooarchaeology, but I was thinking about that too. If there's a situation where it would make sense to further analyze it, like remains, totally down with that. Generally, it's you get the bump. And from other posts I've looked at, a lot of these places, they a lot of different stuff. I mean, you think, you know, it is, but maybe here and there doesn't hurt either. So you find a lot of turtle, find a lot of other things like that. Well, thank you, folks. Thanks for bearing with me. I hope that was good. Thank you very much.
But we're working on it. Marcia Peterson's going to be here. She's the assistant state archaeologist, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And then Larry Todd and Amy Phillips are going to talk about their bison sculpture project they're doing in the Bighorn Basin. And we're turning that over because we're going to have a bison exhibit back in the back room that opens in March. So, that'll be a nice junction there. So thank you guys for coming out. We've got schedules for the Rockpile Museum on the table over there, some posters. Feel free to take those. Thank you. Yes, we're excited about that.
Okay.
I get confused. Yeah.